Clara had spent the better part of her 38 years teaching third graders the foundational, uncomplicated rules of human interaction. Be kind. Share what you have. Apologize sincerely when you hurt someone. And trust that goodness eventually circles back to you. She applied that same gentle, almost naive theology to her marriage with Julian. For exactly 10 years. She had been the quiet, unshakable anchor of his turbulent, high-powered world. While Julian climbed the corporate ladder as a restructuring consultant in Boston, a job that seemed to require an emotional detachment, Clara could scarcely fathom she curated a home for them in the historic coastal town of Newburyport, Massachusetts. It was a life built on soft edges, warm meals, and the unwavering belief that marriage was an exercise in beautiful self-sacrifice. Yet, if Clara were entirely honest with herself, the foundation had begun to feel cold beneath her feet over the last few years. Julian's presence, once a roaring fire that filled the rooms of their beautifully restored colonial home, had dwindled to a dim, flickering ember. He was often late, distant, his eyes perpetually glued to the screen of his smartphone, his mind miles away in boardroom negotiations. When she asked him about it during their increasingly quiet Sunday breakfasts, he would offer a dismissive pat on her hand, attributing his withdrawal to the crushing weight of executive stress. "It's a brutal market right now, Clara," he would say, his voice smooth and authoritative, the very tone he used to pacify anxious stakeholders. "I'm doing this for our future. You just need to keep things running smoothly here." And so, Clara did what she always did. She adjusted. She forgave. And she carried the weight of two people on her own shoulders, convincing herself that love was defined by enduring the lean seasons of affection. The milestone arrived on a crisp, mid-October evening, the exact date of their 10th wedding anniversary. For weeks, Clara had suggested a quiet weekend away in Vermont, a chance to disconnect from the noise and rediscover the intimacy they had lost. Julian had repeatedly declined, citing an immovable corporate acquisition timeline. However, on the morning of their anniversary, his demeanor abruptly changed. He walked into the kitchen wearing one of his custom-tailored suits. A rare, expansive smile warming his sharp features. He kissed her cheek, a practiced, cinematic gesture, and informed her that he had arranged a magnificent surprise. He had booked an exclusive private dining room at the water's edge, the most prestigious waterfront restaurant in Boston, and had invited a select group of close friends and family to celebrate a decade of their union. Clara felt a sudden, fluttering wave of relief. She blamed herself for ever doubting him. He did care. He wanted to celebrate her, to celebrate them, in front of the world. That evening, the autumn wind whipped off the Boston harbor as the valet opened Clara's door. She adjusted the collar of her cream silk dress, a garment she had chosen because Julian always favored classic, understated elegance. Walking through the polished brass doors of the restaurant, she felt a profound sense of anticipation, a hope that tonight would mark the turning of a page, a return to the warmth of their early years. The maitre d' guided her toward the private dining room at the back, where the low murmur of familiar voices drifted through the frosted glass. As the doors glided open, Julian stood at the head of a long, mahogany table gleaming with crystal and silver. He looked every bit the successful, commanding patriarch he aspired to be. But as Clara's eyes swept across the gathered guests, Julian's parents, his sister, and a few of his closest colleagues, her gaze caught on a woman sitting directly to Julian's right. The breath caught sharply in Clara's throat. The woman was elegant, poised, wearing an immaculate black cocktail dress, her posture radiating an effortless, cool confidence. It was Vivienne, Julian's ex-wife, a woman from whom he had been divorced for over 10 years, and whose name had been treated as a forbidden ghost in the history of Clara's marriage. For a terrifying, endless second, the room seemed to tilt beneath Clara's heels. The ambient chatter faded into a dull, underwater hum. She stood frozen in the doorway, her mind scrambling to find a logical explanation. A benign misunderstanding that could explain why the woman who preceded her in Julian's life was sitting at the place of honor on her 10th wedding anniversary. Julian, completely unfazed, stepped forward with an easy, practiced grace. He took Clara by the elbow, his grip just firm enough to serve as a command, and guided her toward the head of the table. There she is," Julian announced, his voice booming with a jovial warmth that felt entirely manufactured to Clara's heightened senses. "Clara, darling, you look beautiful. Look who was finally able to join us. Vivienne was in town from New York on business. And I thought, what better occasion to bring everyone together? After all these years, we are all mature adults, aren't they?" Clara forced her facial muscles into an agonizing approximation of a smile, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Julian's parents, expecting to see a reflection of her own shock or discomfort. But instead, she found only smooth, unsurprised expressions. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor, merely raised her wine glass in a polite, chillingly indifferent nod. They knew. The realization hit Clara with physical force. Everyone at this table had been informed beforehand. She was the only one left in the dark, an outsider, at her own commemoration. As she sank into the chair opposite Vivienne, the dinner commenced, transforming into a surreal exercise in psychological torture. Julian did not look at Clara. Instead, his attention was magnetized by Vivienne. He immediately launched into a series of lively, nostalgic anecdotes from their time living in Manhattan, recalling elite galas, inside jokes, and shared vacations with an enthusiasm Clara had not witnessed from him in half a decade. Vivienne, to her credit, did not look triumphant. In fact, as the night wore on, Clara noticed a distinct, flickering shadow of discomfort in the older woman's expressive gray eyes. Vivienne answered Julian's boisterous prompts with calm, measured brevity. Never leaning into the flirtation Julian seemed to be projecting. She did not look like a woman trying to reclaim an old flame. She looked like someone trapped in a poorly scripted play, watching a director lose control of the narrative. But Julian was oblivious, or perhaps entirely indifferent, to the atmospheric tension. He dominated the conversation, treating Clara like an administrative assistant who happened to be sharing his table, occasionally asking her to pass the bread or signal the waiter. While he and his family debated the finer points of a summer house in Maine that he and Vivienne had once rented, Clara sat in agonizing silence, the heavy silk of her dress feeling like a shroud, realizing that her 10 years of quiet devotion were being actively erased in a single evening of public performance. The crescendo of the humiliation arrived with the dessert course. Julian stood up, tapping his crystal dessert spoon against his champagne flute, drawing the eyes of the entire room, as well as several patrons from the main dining area through the partial partition. He cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks with that characteristic, self-satisfied flourish. A decade is a significant milestone. Julian began, looking around the table, his eyes lingering on his corporate colleagues before briefly brushing past Clara to settle fully on his ex-wife. Many people think that a marriage is built solely in isolation, but I believe a man is shaped by his entire journey, by the people who set him on his path, who demanded the best of him before he even knew what his potential was. I want to raise a glass tonight to the architecture of my life. He raised the flute higher, locking eyes with Vivienne. To transitions, to growth, and to the truth. Without Vivienne, none of us would be here tonight. She was the one who taught me what it truly takes to build an empire. Ah, Polite. Murmured applause rippled through the table. Clara sat entirely paralyzed, the blood draining from her face, feeling the cold, clinical sting of a knife delivered with absolute, theatrical precision. The drive back to Newburyport was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The interior of Julian's luxury sedan was silent save for the low, monotonous hum of the tires against the wet asphalt of Route 1. Clara stared out the passenger window, watching the street lamps bleed into long, skeletal streaks of white light against the darkness. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She waited for him to speak. For an apology, an explanation, any sign that he possessed a shred of awareness regarding the emotional execution he had performed. When they finally pulled into their gravel driveway, Julian turned off the ignition, unbuckled his seatbelt, and let out a long, theatrical sigh of exhaustion. Well, that was a highly successful evening, he said, his voice entirely flat, as if he were concluding a standard quarterly review. The partners were deeply impressed by the venue. Clara turned to him, her voice trembling, but quiet. Julian, how could you do that? How could you bring Vivienne to our anniversary dinner without telling me? You spent the entire night acting as though I were a ghost. As though your marriage to her was the only relationship that ever mattered. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he adopted a look of profound, paternalistic disappointment, an expression Clara had come to dread over the years. Oh, Clara, don't start with the histrionics, he said, his tone dripping with a cold, dismissive pity. You are completely overreacting. You always do this. Take a perfectly lovely evening and turn it into a melodrama centered entirely around your own insecurities. Vivienne is an important contact. Her firm handles major real estate portfolios in New York. It was a strategic, mature dinner. If you possessed a bit more social sophistication, you would understand that. I suggest you go to bed and look at yourself in the mirror before you accuse me of anything. The gaslighting was seamless. A finely tuned mechanism that Julian had deployed so often over the last decade that Clara's immediate, deeply conditioned response was to doubt her own sanity. She lay awake for hours in their king-sized bed, listening to the rhythmic, unbothered sound of Julian's breathing beside her. But for the first time in 10 years, the fog did not settle over her mind. Instead, the pain acted as a strange, clarifying agent. A flood of memories broke through her defenses, recontextualizing a decade of small, unexplained anomalies. She remembered how Julian had fiercely guarded the details of his first marriage, claiming it was an irrelevant youth error that he preferred to bury. She remembered how his family had always dropped their voices when she entered a room, how Eleanor would make subtle, passive-aggressive remarks about Clara's quaint teaching salary compared to the high-stakes world Julian belonged to. She had always assumed she was just being sensitive. Now, she saw the architecture of her own subordination. The following morning, Julian left the house before dawn, leaving nothing but an empty coffee mug on the granite counter. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, staring blankly at her lesson plans for the upcoming week. At precisely 9 o'clock, her phone vibrated on the wooden surface. It was a text message from an unknown number with a New York area code. Clara opened it, her breath hitching as she read the words printed across the screen. Clara. This is Vivienne. I am deeply sorry for last night. It was not what I was led to believe it would be. We need to speak. Away from Julian. I am staying at the Harbor Hotel in Boston until tomorrow morning. Please. Let me buy you a coffee. You deserve the truth. Clara stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. Every instinct cultivated by 10 years of marital compliance screamed at her to delete the message. To protect her husband. To avoid the messiness of confrontation. But a deeper, older instinct, the part of her that Julian had spent a decade slowly extinguishing, demanded to be heard. She stood up, closed her laptop, walked to the closet, and grabbed her coat. She typed a brief, resolute reply. I will be there in an hour. The conservatory at the Harbor Hotel was washed in the gray, muted light of a New England autumn. Vivienne was already seated in a secluded corner booth. A cup of untouched black coffee sitting before her. Stripped of the dramatic lighting of the restaurant and the oppressive energy of Julian's presence, she looked different, still remarkably elegant, but carrying a visible weight of exhaustion and a quiet, unmistakable regret. As Clara approached, Vivienne rose, offering a small, tentative nod of respect. There was no hostility between them. No competitive tension of two women fighting over the same man. Instead, there was the somber solemnity of two survivors standing on the same treacherous piece of ground. Clara sat down, wrapping her hands around a warm mug, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Thank you for coming, Clara. Vivienne began, her voice low and steady. Stripped of any theatricality, I won't mince words. Last night was an abomination. And I realized the moment you walked into that room that Julian had lied to me just as thoroughly as he has been lying to you. He told me that you were fully aware of my attendance, that it was your idea to invite me as a gesture of family healing to please his parents. If I had known the truth, I would have never set foot in that city. Vivienne paused, taking a slow breath, looking intently into Clara's eyes. Julian is a master of curation, Clara. He curates his image, his career, and 10 years ago, he curated you. You need to understand what happened when our marriage ended, because it explains exactly why you are sitting here today. What followed was a revelation that shattered the entire narrative of Clara's adult life. Vivienne explained that 10 years ago, Julian was not the wildly successful, self-made tycoon he claimed to be. In reality, his first corporate venture had collapsed into an abyss of catastrophic debt and unethical financial irregularities. He had leveraged everything, including Vivienne's personal assets. And when the dust settled, his reputation in the financial sector was utterly ruined. Vivienne had filed for divorce, refusing to enable his reckless, controlling behavior or shield him from the consequences of his arrogance. Julian found himself socially ostracized, financially decimated, and desperately needing a complete, total reinvention to salvage his public standing. He didn't just need capital, he needed an entirely new identity. He didn't marry you because he fell in love with you, Clara, Vivienne said, the words falling like lead weights into the quiet space between them. He married you because he was drowning, and you were the perfect life raft. He needed a woman who was a financial clean slate, someone with an unblemished credit history, a stable, respectable career like teaching that screamed morality to his investors, and above all, a temperament that was gentle, forgiving, and easily managed. He targeted your empathy. He knew that a woman who spent her life giving would never think twice about how much he was taking. I discovered the full extent of it only recently. Through old financial files his father accidentally forwarded to my office during a property dispute. I warned him a decade ago not to drag an innocent person into his calculated redemption arc. But Julian doesn't see people. Clara. He sees assets. Clara sat completely motionless, her body numb, as if her central nervous system had shut down to prevent her from feeling the sheer magnitude of the destruction. The coffee shop around her continued its cheerful, mundane operations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the light laughter of tourists, while her entire reality was being systematically dismantled. I know this is impossible to accept on faith alone, Vivienne said gently, her voice tinged with a profound, feminine sorrow. She reached into her leather designer bag and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the marble tabletop. This was inside a box of old documents that Julian left in my storage unit years ago. It's a letter he wrote to me exactly 3 weeks before he proposed to you, when he was still desperately trying to convince me to drop the divorce and help him rebuild his firm. Read it. You need to read it to free yourself. With trembling fingers, Clara withdrew the single sheet of heavy bond paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Julian's, the elegant, slanting, aggressive, cursive she had seen on 1,000 grocery lists, birthday cards, and financial documents. She focused on the ink, her eyes scanning the paragraphs until they locked onto a section halfway down the page. Her breath hitched, a cold, suffocating hand wrapping around her throat as she read his private thoughts, preserved in ink from a decade ago. You think I am ruined, Vivienne, but you underestimate my ability to adapt. I have met someone. Her name is Clara. She is a school teacher, wholesome, simple, completely untainted by the cynicism of our world. She is exactly what the board needs to see to believe I have reformed. More importantly, she is manageable. She has an innate, almost pathetic need to feel needed. If I give her a little attention, she will gladly take care of everything else without a single complaint. She'll never leave. She doesn't have the stomach for conflict. With her stability anchoring my credit and my image, I will be back on top within 5 years. I don't even have to try with her. She is a guaranteed investment with zero liability. A single, hot tear escaped Clara's eye, dropping silently onto the paper, smudging the word investment. She did not sob, she did not scream. The grief she felt was too massive for such small expressions. It was a crushing, tectonic shift. For 10 years, she had believed she was a partner in a sacred covenant. She had blamed herself for his coldness, had spent countless nights wondering how she could be a better, more supportive wife, how she could ease the stress of his monumental life. Now, the grotesque truth was laid bare. She was never a wife. She was a strategic asset, a public relations campaign, a shield against his creditors, and a domestic servant hired under the pretense of love. Every anniversary, every shared meal, every soft word had been a calculated transaction designed to maintain the security of his investment. She looked up at Vivienne, her eyes cleared of all illusions, reflecting a cold, brilliant light. Thank you, Clara whispered, her voice cracking, but entirely devoid of fear. Thank you for giving me my life back. The woman who drove back to Newburyport that afternoon was not the same woman who had left it. The gentle, compliant schoolteacher had vanished, replaced by an entity that was entirely calm, completely focused, and terrifyingly deliberate. Clara understood that against a man like Julian, an emotional outburst would be entirely useless. If she cried, if she confronted him with the letter, he would deploy his well-worn arsenal of gaslighting. He would claim the letter was a forgery, that it was written out of anger, that she was being irrational and crazy. He would use his superior financial resources to isolate her, lock her out of their accounts, and paint her as an unstable woman to their community. She would not afford him that luxury. She would not give him a battlefield where his weapons had power. She would fight him in the dark, using the very traits he had mocked in his letter: her patience, her meticulousness, and her ability to endure. Clara began her quiet, mechanical execution the very next morning. She did not change her daily routine by a single fraction. She continued to make Julian's coffee exactly the way he liked it, kissed his cheek when he left, and listened with polite, empty nods as he droned on about his corporate conquests. But the moment the garage door closed, her real work began. Her first call was not to a friend or a family member, but to Eleanor Vance, the most formidable, cutthroat divorce attorney in the state of Massachusetts. A woman known for dismantling wealthy men with surgical precision. When Clara laid the letter and 10 years of joint financial statements on Vance's desk, the attorney raised an eyebrow, a predatory smile touching her lips. "He thinks you're a liability with zero stomach for conflict," Vance murmured. "Let's show him what happens when an investment matures." Over the next 3 months, Clara operated like a ghost within her own home. She quietly opened a separate bank account at an institution Julian had no connection with, redirecting her own salary and systematically transferring small, unnoticeable increments of their joint savings, amounts small enough to escape the notice of his automated accounting alerts. She meticulously duplicated every financial record, every tax return, every hidden offshore statement Julian kept in his locked study. Using a master key she had discovered years ago and never mentioned. More importantly, she quietly ceased paying the supplemental bills she had historically covered with her own teaching income to help the household, the high-end landscaping fees, the club memberships, the private insurance premiums. She allowed those expenses to slowly drain Julian's primary liquidity accounts. Watching from the sidelines, as his operational margins began to tighten under the weight of his own lavish lifestyle, Julian noticed none of it, blinded by his own monumental arrogance. He saw only what he wanted to see: his quiet, predictable wife, keeping his house clean and his dinner warm, completely unaware that the walls of his fortress were being systematically hollowed out from within. The winter snow was beginning to blanket the grounds of their Newburyport estate when Julian announced his latest triumph. He had finally secured the senior partnership at his firm, an achievement that would cement his status at the pinnacle of the Boston elite. To celebrate, he instructed Clara to organize an opulent dinner party at their home, inviting the entire board of directors, his wealthiest clients, his family, and their prominent neighbors. He wanted a grand performance of his success, anchored by his picture-perfect home and his impeccably supportive wife. Clara accepted the assignment with a serene, terrifying compliance. She curated the evening down to the last detail: the catering, the string quartet, the vintage champagne. She even insisted on sending out a special, handwritten invitation to a guest Julian would never expect. It was to be a night of grand celebrations. Indeed, on the evening of the gala, the house radiated warmth and luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 50 of the most influential people in Julian's professional and social circle. Julian moved through the crowd like a king, his laughter loud and expansive, accepting congratulations with an effortless arrogance. At precisely 9 o'clock, as the guests gathered in the expansive, 2-story, great room for the formal toasts, Clara walked up the small steps of the grand staircase, holding a silver microphone. She tapped it gently, the sound echoing through the high ceilings, instantly silencing the room. Julian stood at the base of the stairs, a glass of champagne in his hand, looking up at her with a smug, Approving smile. Waiting for his public coronation. Good evening, everyone. Clara began. Her voice remarkably clear, steady, and entirely devoid of fear or anger. She looked out at the sea of faces, the partners, the politicians, the family members who had looked through her for a decade. Thank you all for being here to celebrate a milestone. For 10 years, I have lived in this community, and many of you have known me as Julian's wife, the quiet school teacher who stayed in the background. Tonight, I want to share with you the foundational lesson I have learned during my decade in this house. You see, I used to teach my students that marriage was about love, trust, and mutual sacrifice. But my husband, Julian, taught me a much more sophisticated lesson. He taught me that marriage is actually an architecture of calculation. It is about asset management. It is about finding a woman whose credit is clean, whose temperament is manageable, and whose empathy can be leveraged to rebuild a ruined reputation. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The smiles froze on the guests' faces. Julian's hand tightened around his champagne flute, his eyes widening in a mixture of confusion and sudden, rising fury. He took a step toward the stairs, his voice a harsh, low hiss. Clara, what the hell are you doing? Shut this down immediately. But Clara did not stop. She raised her left hand, which held a stack of neatly printed papers. I have prepared a small commemorative gift for everyone tonight, she said with a brilliant, chilling smile. As you leave, you will find copies of a letter my husband wrote 10 years ago, outlining exactly how he used me as an investment with zero liability to shield himself from his creditors and fool his investors into believing he was a reformed man. And speaking of investments, Clara looked toward the heavy oak front doors of the estate, which opened precisely on cue. Vivienne walked into the foyer, elegant, calm, and holding a legal portfolio. She walked past the stunned crowd, stopped next to Julian, and looked up at Clara with a definitive nod. The investment? Clara concluded into the microphone, her voice ringing with absolute authority, has officially reached maturity. Julian, you have been served. The collapse of Julian's world was not a cinematic explosion. It was a slow, agonizing, and absolute implosion. In the high-stakes corporate world of Boston, reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. And Julian's currency had just become entirely worthless. The partners of his firm, men who obsessed over risk management and public perception, could not tolerate a senior partner whose private monstrousness and historical financial irregularities had been laid bare to their primary clients in a single evening. Within 48 hours of the gala, Julian was placed on an indefinite administrative leave. Within a week, his forced resignation was finalized. His name quietly scraped from the glass doors of the high-rise office overlooking the financial district. But the true weight of his punishment, the real karma, did not come from the financial blow. It came from the absolute, chilling isolation that followed. Julian was a man who existed entirely through the reflection of others. His self-worth was entirely dependent on the envy and respect of his peers. Now, that reflection was gone. The very people who had clinked glasses with him at his dining table refused to return his phone calls. His wealthy neighbors turned their heads when his car passed them on the coastal roads. Even his own family, his mother, Eleanor, and his sister, who had enabled his behavior for years, quietly distanced themselves, eager to protect their own fragile social standing from the radioactive fallout of his ruin. Julian found himself wandering the echoing, empty rooms of his massive, hollow estate, entirely alone, realizing that the network of superficial loyalty he had built was just as transactional as the marriage he had engineered. Clara's divorce petition moved through the Massachusetts court system like a juggernaut. Backed by the devastating evidence of the letter and the meticulous financial records she had compiled, Eleanor Vance secured an absolute victory. Julian was stripped of the historical assets he had tried so desperately to protect. Forced to liquidate the Newburyport estate to satisfy the legal judgments and the division of property. There was no dramatic jail sentence. No cinematic bankruptcy. Karma, in its finest and most poetic form, simply stripped Julian of his mask, leaving him to live the rest of his days in the cold reality of his own true nature, a man who had spent his life manipulating everyone around him, only to discover that he had successfully manipulated himself into an absolute, unresolvable solitude. A year later, the salt air off the Atlantic felt clean as it blew through the open windows of Clara's new home. It was a small, light-filled cottage situated on a quiet cliffside in Rockport, miles away from the manicured, oppressive luxury of her old life. The floors were simple pine, the furniture was mismatched and comfortable, and the rooms were filled with the chaotic, vibrant artwork of her third-grade students. There were no grand performances here, no curated images, no heavy, unspoken expectations hanging in the air. There was only the quiet, beautiful rhythm of a life reclaimed. Clara stood at her small kitchen island, pouring a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the New England sky in shades of deep lavender and gold. Her phone rested on the counter, vibrating with a single incoming text. It was from Vivienne. A simple message checking in, sharing a brief update about an interior design project in the city. They had not become best friends. Their history was too complicated, too anchored in a shared trauma for easy casualness, but they shared an unshakable, profound bond of mutual respect. They were two women who had been selected to be casualties in a selfish man's narrative and who had instead chosen to become the authors of their own freedom. Clara walked out onto her small wooden porch, wrapping her sweater tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill, listening to the eternal, rhythmic crash of the waves against the granite rocks below. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace that she had never known in all her years of striving, performing, and sacrificing. She realized then that the ultimate tragedy of her marriage was not that Julian had never truly loved her. The true tragedy was that she had spent 10 years believing that love was something she had to earn through endless compliance, total self-effacement, and the erasure of her own boundaries. She looked out at the vast, open ocean, her heart light, her mind clear, knowing that she would never trade her truth for a perfect lie again. She had finally learned the final, to most important lesson of her life, that her worth was never up for negotiation, and that peace, true peace, begins the moment you stop asking for permission to exist.